Boson,
Here.
Simonson, Voss,
Here.
Coleman, Westergaard,
Here.
Mandelbaum, Gatto.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Okay, Malcolm Hankins, who's over these area, has done a lot of work in this, on the encroachment. So if you want to go ahead, Malcolm, and make your presentation.
Thank you, Mayor. Right here. Okay. Good morning, Mayor, members of City Council. Malcolm Hankins, Des Moines Assistant City Manager. This morning, a group of staff and myself will present to you proposed ordinance recommendations related to encroachments. It's important to note that as we walk through this presentation, that there will be two distinct sections of code under the Chapter 102 ordinance section that we'll be walking through. One section will deal directly with the encroachment process that we've used for some time. I will have members of staff from Neighborhood Services who will speak to our current process, and then we'll walk through the process that is recommended as per the proposed ordinance. The second element of what you'll hear this morning relates to a section of the ordinance that prohibits camping. And that is a new section of code that has been drafted for council's consideration. So I'll start out by giving a high-level overview, and then I'll pass it over to the Neighborhood Services staff, Dalton Jacobus and Chris Johansson, who are here to speak to those specifics. I'll follow up after their presentation and walk through the prohibited camping section. So by way of a quick background, the encroachment process is under Chapter 102. The revisions are quite simply to change the timeline for notice as well as a timeline for appeals process. In addition to that change, you'll hear about the city requiring itself to store items as opposed to not storing those items with this new revision that's proposed. And then we'll walk through the prohibited camping, as I mentioned earlier, and talk to you about the enforcement process that's involved in that. Again, an overview, the prohibited camping ordinance relates to people behavior. When I get into that portion of the section, the presentation, you'll hear about what constitutes camping, etc. The timeline for not camping or being notified to cease camping is immediate, and the timeline to remove any items that are associated with camping is 24 hours. This is distinct from the encroachment ordinance, which is an object prohibition. So the items that we typically clean up in our process that have been going on for years, that's the section that you'll hear first. So I'll pass it on to Dalton, I believe, who's going to handle the next section.
Mayor, Council, my name is Dalton Jacobus. I'm the Neighborhood Inspections Division Administrator. Mr. Voss, can you hear us all right?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to give you an overview of kind of the current state and how we're doing things, and then I'll hand it over to our department director to talk about maybe some of the upcoming changes here. So the Neighborhood Services Department enforces on the encampments through the encroachment ordinance. That's currently in the code in Chapter 102-2. It's important to note that Neighborhood Services is not the only department that does use this, so there's no planned changes to the definition of encroachment. So Public Works, Engineering, everybody can use this. It's up to the department director, but it's not just Neighborhood Services, and there are no planned changes to this definition. As I spoke about, there are many different departments that kind of have their fingers in this. On the encroachment side of things, as neighborhood services enforces them, it's kind of a team effort with us, police, public works, fire, EMS, parks. So here's some quick figures for you. Since about early March of 2024, the city spent around $150,000 on encroachment removals, and those are the encampment removals that we're talking about today. We've received 197 unique complaints, and 93 enforcement cases have been started for encroachments located on public property. So at least that many, if not more, have been started on private property, but they're handled through a different section of the code. There's about...
This is from
Yes.
March to now.
Right.
Okay.
Yes. So that would be calendar year 2024. But given the cold weather moratorium, we didn't really start enforcing again in 2024 until about late February, early March. We had the cold weather moratorium, and then we also had the point-in-time survey moratorium. The council last heard about this, I think it was a few years ago, and the annual cleanup cost is about $50,000, so significantly more cleanup costs. That does not include any of my time or my staff's time on handling this. There's currently about 4 FTEs for neighborhood services that are involved in this process, about 3 FTEs on field staff, and then between myself and my supervisors, there's probably about 40 hours a week wrapped up into it as well. So our current process is, as outlined in the code, is to post a 10-day notice. That 10-day notice is basically telling people you can't have your belongings here, and it's important to note the neighborhood services is only involved with the property. We don't need to get involved with enforcing on the people. As with all of our programs, it's the property, not the people. So there's an opportunity to file an appeal. If an appeal is filed, we schedule a hearing with an administrative law judge. That can take a couple months to get on the hearing schedule. While it's on the schedule, there's a pause in enforcement and nothing's done. If there's no appeal filed, we get it re-inspected and then referred to the Public Works Department for a cleanup. So best case scenario, from when we receive the complaint to when the cleanup happens, it's about 2 weeks. And if there is an appeal filed and it hits the point-in-time survey, hits a cold weather moratorium, it can be, we've had them last for 6 months before. There is language in the code that allows for emergency action to be taken on camps. We're pretty conservative with exercising that authority, typically reserved for accumulations of raw and spoiling food product, human waste, garbage, things that would cause like an immediate issue to the public. So usually when we post a 10-day notice, it's followed up by, or usually when we post or do an emergency cleanup, it's followed by a 10-day notice. So we're only taking the items on an emergency cleanup that constitute an emergency. I kind of alluded to this a bit earlier, but there's 4 major items that cause delays in the encroachment cleanup process. The first one is the appeals. By providing due process and getting it onto the hearing schedule, that can take a couple months right now. The same ALJ, administrative law judge, that hears these cases also hears our health and sanitation appeals. They hear appeals for public works on like the snow removal stuff, so they hear appeals. It's mostly NID and zoning, mostly NID I should say, but they do hear them from other departments as well. Another item that leads to a delay is the cold weather moratorium. So it's a city policy to not conduct cleanups or post notices for 48 hours prior to the forecasted wind chill being at or below 10 degrees above zero. And so the last couple years we've taken enforcement up until about December 20th, and then it doesn't really start again in earnest until late February usually. There are 2 point-in-time surveys that the city conducts. One of them is the last Wednesday in January, and one of them is the last Wednesday in July. It's city policy to not conduct any enforcement, post notices, cleanups, anything like that, for 2 weeks leading up to those point in time surveys. Reason being is that we want folks to stay still so that we can get a good count, service providers can get a good count, and kind of try to wrap your hands around the issue a bit more. And then the fourth one is the site conditions. So we've had an extremely wet spring. There's some camps that we can't get to clean them up without causing more damage, without getting equipment stuck. All right. It's you or Chris? All right. Thank you.
Morning, Council. Chris Johansson, Neighborhood Service Director. So this part's just talk about the proposed changes to the existing ordinance. So on the left we have the current ordinance, and then on the right it's a proposed ordinance. So as you can see, the notice is going to change from 10 days down to 3 days. The next is the appeal period, which in the past has been 10 days. That moved down to 3 as well. And then last would be the removal and disposal of all items. One thing that we are adding is the storage of personal items.
I have a question the way that's
Yep.
presented. Doesn't the current ordinance require holding on to items for 90 days for abandoned property?
I don't believe it does.
I mean, here, I can go to the ordinance if that's helpful.
Yeah, not for storage though.
But I want to understand what the current item is. Like, that would be helpful to just get an explanation then. I've got to pull up, sorry. Give me a second. It's in the first paragraph that's amended. If any abandoned property is referred to in the reference sections has been or is kept for 90 days or more without being claimed, it may be disposed of by the city manager. And we're changing the 90 days to 30 days. What is that? What is that provision?
My understanding is under this ordinance change that we are storing the items. I'm not sure under the old ordinance if we were ever storing items though.
Okay, so we might have, like, there was discretion under the old ordinance, and if we exercise that discretion, the ordinance said to store it for 90
days.
Now, we're taking away discretion and making storage mandatory and only for 30 days.
That's the way I understand it. Yep.
Okay, thank you for the clarification.
Yeah. Let me just get to the timeline a little bit. But one of the things we've talked about, and this is stuff that we're still working through with Public Works staff. I know our staff is going to have to meet with legal department just for further guidance. But what I envision is at the day of the cleanup, we will bring out a container that if any personal items are left behind, we would be able to put those items into a container where we will be able to remove that and store it more likely at the Public Works facility. Individuals would then be able to contact neighborhood services staff to be able to get access back to those items.
Thank you.
Okay, implementation timeline. So obviously today's first reading. There's second, third reading. Thing I did touch on is when we get after the third reading's done, have staff be able to meet with legal, work with police department, and additionally with public works staff, just to go over process, go over training.
So if it's passed today, none of it will be implemented until you meet with all those departments and have a plan in place, correct?
There's 14 days after ordinance adoption before we could get started.
And you won't need more than 14 days?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Can I jump in?
Yeah,
Maybe
please.
Connie wants to on this.
We're going to clarify because in the ordinance, and we get into the ordinance, there is a list of projects that we are giving to the city manager to complete, and I will guarantee you it will take more than 14 days. And we will go over those when we get to that portion.
Yep.
Because nothing will be implemented till some of these factors are put in, which we'll talk about.
Yeah. One of the other items, just to note, as you see on there, under the August 2024 post-hire administrative hearing officer, historically, the city used to have its own administrative hearing officer on staff. City went through some changes. Those hearings are now done through the state of Iowa through an administrative law judge. So one of the things that we are looking into, not certain we're going to do this yet, but in order to speed up that hearing process, sometimes it could take up to 2 months to get those scheduled, and that's just due to volume. It's not just these encroachments. It's other hearing items that the city of Des Moines does work through the administrative law judge. So that's one thing that we are considering, is hiring that position to be for the city of Des Moines, just to handle these types of encroachments. Okay. Any other questions? We are going to move to the camping prohibition coming up.
I've got a couple of questions.
Yep.
Do we have an estimate of on the cost provisions related to this? So there are a number of pieces that come with this. There's more frequent enforcement. There's storage. There's hiring an ALJ. Do we have an estimate what those costs may be?
Not with, the thing with the cost for the encroachment cleanups, I mean, the dollars that we have right now, that's the best we could do, factoring out through the remainder of the year. Administrative law judge, salary and benefits, we have not looked at what that would be for the city yet. The one thing I would tell you, the more, right now, the cleanups do get more expensive the more material that's accumulated at site, with the cleanups happening faster. I think there would be less materials there. Storage right now, it's all proposed to be handled in-house. So we're not talking additional staff. Most of that's going to be handled by neighborhood services staff, public works staff.
So does that mean there are things that we're currently doing today that we'll no longer do, so staff have time to do that?
We don't have time to do it. It'll be delayed, I think some of the other things, but we're not proposing hiring additional staff.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you don't know what current services we provide that will be delayed to?
Just knowing the staff that we use to do this, the staff that currently and has always done this has worked with our public nuisance properties, vacant property registry, ordinance. So that's the same staff we'll be using for this.
Okay. So those, we could expect maybe delays on those items.
Yeah.
The other question I had, we're going from 10 days to 3 days in the proposal. Why was that specific duration chosen?
I don't know if I can answer that for you. I really don't. I really don't.
Oh, yes. Thanks, Chris. Yep. Staff was asked to look at shortening the time frame. There was no specific model that we based it on, but it was taking it down from 10 days to 3 days. Also, the 3 days was identified as a means to continue to provide due process, to make sure that there were no concerns with due process in that time period.
But you just said there was a model. So
I said there was not.
there was not. So is there any model for the due process piece behind 3 days?
Not that I'm specifically aware of.
Okay. So, and I know we've heard from the ACLU about this already. Have we factored in the cost of litigation? I mean, how much, do we have an estimate for what litigation would cost if we're challenged on this?
I do not, no.
Okay, thank you.
So I'll walk us,
Go through the next slide.
yes. So I'm going to walk through the camping prohibition proposed ordinance. Again, this is separate from the encroachment cleanup process that we've been using for a number of years. For a high-level view of this one, the camping prohibition language of the proposed ordinance prohibits sleeping in public rights-of-way, streets, sidewalks, alleys, and doorways. It prohibits a campsite occupancy on any sidewalk, street, alley, lane, public right-of-way, park, bench, etc. The violations for the fine for violating this ordinance is a $50 fine. As stated earlier, an individual who is found to be in violation of this ordinance would be required to immediately cease camping, but also have 24 hours afforded and a notice to remove the items. As a matter of practice, the intent would be to have staff provide resource information at the time of contact, and also have a coordinated effort with police department, who will be assisting on this as well as our service provider to be identified to be on site as we make these contacts. Another part of the ordinance that was not a part of the original draft is the inability to pay becomes an affirmative defense for those individuals who might be cited under this ordinance. So I think some of you already are aware of this, but the ordinance was modeled after the Grants Pass, Oregon ordinance, though not entirely. In that ordinance, or the court, in their decision, the Supreme Court decision, found that the criminal provisions of the Grants Pass ordinance did not constitute a violation of cruel and unusual punishment under the law, under the Eighth Amendment. The portions that some examples of where we did not adopt the language is with the penalty section, as well as the appeals language is not the same. And we also incorporated the affirmative defense portion, which was not the same as Grants Pass. So some key terms in the ordinance. To camp is defined, means to set up or to remain at a campsite. A campsite, as defined by the ordinance, the proposed ordinance, is listed there: bedding, sleeping bag, or other material used for bedding purposes, for the purpose of maintaining a temporary place to live. And so personal property, which is also a key element of the ordinance, is any item reasonably recognizable as belonging to a person or having apparent utility or monetary value. These excerpts are coming straight out of the ordinance. So if there are questions about the language, staff is available to try to answer those for you. So sleeping on sidewalks, streets, alleys, or doorways is prohibited under the ordinance. The language is there. A fine for doing so is punishable, as stated earlier, by $50. And in addition to the remedy provided by law, any person found in violation can be removed. Again, this is the language that expressly prohibits camping in public spaces, as identified earlier. And here's the process that outlines the proposed ordinance's ability to address campsites by removal. So prior to the removal, a notice shall be posted by the city. There's a contact listed on that notice, and a minimum of 24 hours is provided for an individual who is camping to remove their items. Again, this is different from the encroachment cleanup process based on the definition of what constitutes camping. As you'll see in subsection B, along with the 24-hour notice, the ordinance requires that a local agency be contacted and informed of the campsite and our intent to notify. Again, the intent of the process that's been discussed is to have a coordinated effort where individuals from service providers as well as city staff are on the site at the same time. And again, after the 24-hour notice period, the city is authorized under the proposed ordinance to remove the items that might remain. Here's the section of the proposed ordinance that deals primarily with storage. If the items are of no apparent utility or monetary value, those items would be removed and not retained. But items that do meet the requirement of apparent utility or monetary value will be stored at a city facility at this proposed time for 30 days. That process, again, is being worked out, but the intent would be that the city would manage this process and not an outside entity. Individuals who are subject to this ordinance who would appeal the disposition of their personal property. Just to be clear, there's no real plan for, or under the ordinance, it doesn't address us retaining personal items except in situations where those items are believed to be evidence of criminal activity or weapons or things of that nature. So if there's anything else, there wouldn't be a need to appeal because the city is releasing those items when those individuals request them. And you've heard a little bit of this already, but we'll just go over it just high level. Public Works' role in this process will be to transport toters to the cleanup site. We'll place materials inside those or work with the individuals who might be there who are not able to remove those items, and so we will let them know that they can be stored. They will maintain a storage facility for those items between 7 a.m. and 3 p.m. Neighborhood services will be on site to help to identify what constitutes the items to be maintained or not. And we have a retrieval process that is underway with a phone number and neighborhood services for folks to call in the event they have items that they'd like to recover. The implementation timeline for this process is identical to the implementation timeline for the previous presentation or the previous encampment portion of this presentation. So today is the first reading. We would walk through the process as you see here. As the mayor indicated, there are some requirements that we suspect we will have things in order, safety net provisions in order before we implement. But this is the proposed timeline, factoring those things in. Thank you.
Thank you.
Questions?
Does anyone have any other questions, or because there will be questions within the ordinance too? Fine.
I've got a few questions that I'm interested in understanding a little better. So one of the things that I've heard is that this is a camping ordinance, not a homeless ordinance. And I had a question just from looking at the definition. Can you give an example where this would apply to a non-homeless person? And have we had any issues with non-homeless people camping in our community?
Let me get to the definition if I can, just really quickly. To your second question, I am not sure about whether or not there are individuals who are non-homeless and camping. So, but your first question was an example of someone who might not be homeless.
Yeah, would this would apply to?
I mean, I know of scenarios where people have done this through events. I know Ragbri, there were tents pretty much across the city that an exception could be made for in this case under the ordinance. As far as an individual who might not be homeless, I think if you look at the definition, it can apply to anyone doing it. But as your point is, most likely someone who has no.
But Ragbride's less than 24 hours they're camping.
Yeah, but I'm kind of trying to find an example of
Okay.
a scenario that,
That's not similar to
Yeah.
to what we're talking.
Okay, let's keep moving on to the,
There-
what's your next question? Go ahead, Matt.
Well, I think an example could be if anyone camping on the levee, group of teenagers were fishing on a levee and set up a campsite, you wouldn't want them being on that levee, potentially damaging it for an extended period of time. It's a hypothetical.
Yeah. I wanted to ask a little bit about some of the language, and it's both pieces, although the language that says no person may sleep on public sidewalks, streets, alleys, doorways, or public rights-of-way at any time as a matter of individual and public safety. Does that include city parks?
city parks are addressed under the ordinance in that particular section. Don't know if that section itself.
It says camping prohibited, sidewalk, streets, alley, public right-of-way, park, bench, or any other publicly owned property or under a bridge or a viaduct.
Right. I'm talking about the sleeping ban and parks. So several of us were on the park tour just last week, right? And we got off at Grays Lake, and there were a couple people at Grays Lake Beach that were sleeping. Are we banning that as part of this action or not? I just want to understand, is that something we're banning?
Yeah, my recollection is that what you see on the screen does not call out parks specifically for sleeping. So there's a prohibition under sleeping, but I don't believe that language is directly related to parks, but I'll defer to the city attorney's office who helped to draft this to see if they have the right, if I have the right recollection.
The language regarding sleeping does not include parks.
Okay, so the language regarding sleeping does not include parks. Thank you for that clarification. So under the sleeping section as well, this is, I think, in both sections. Well, no, this might be only the sleeping section. Part D, in addition to any other remedy provided by law, any person found in violation of this section may be immediately removed from the premises. So by immediately removed, do we mean arrested?
Again, I don't know that necessarily means an arrest. I'm not, I'll defer to our police department. We do have a representative here who can speak to what their plan is.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to
I'll just
understand.
let Tom answer. I think Tom knows probably the answers.
The language in that section does not refer to arrest. It simply refers to a removal.
So how do you remove someone who doesn't voluntarily remove themselves from the premises? Like if someone says, I don't want to leave, how do you remove them without arresting them?
Mayor, Councilman, Major McTaggart, Operations, Des Moines Police Department. From reading the ordinance, my understanding or my interpretation of this would be we would ask you to leave. If you chose not to leave, we would enforce it by arrest.
Okay, so there would be arrests?
Yes. If you chose not to leave, you're given time to pack up and leave, and you still chose not to leave.
And then after the arrest, they would be taken to jail then?
Yes.
Okay. I guess my follow-up question is how does that comport with the statement that imprisonment is not a punishment for this offense?
Josh, I guess what would you like anyone to do then? Just if you don't abide by any law, you don't get to do anything. So if we pass a code or a law, you don't want anybody to do anything? Is that what you want? So we don't have to follow any laws or any.
Joe, hold on just a second. We're going to have our attorney talk to this issue,
I'm asking about the
which
ordinance
is
as
fine.
drafted.
We're getting clarification. We're getting clarification.
The ordinance provides several alternatives. One is the removal that you referred to. That was one of the alternatives.
Could you speak?
The,
Mike, there's chatter in the back. Could you speak?
Yes. Can everyone please be quiet so everybody can hear?
The ordinance provides several alternatives. One is removal, as you've already referred to. Violation of the ordinance is a simple misdemeanor and is subject to arrest, but arrest is not the same as imprisonment. Just as a matter of law, they are not the same thing.
Okay. So with arrest, for a simple mistake, like for arrest, I mean, how long could someone be detained in jail if they're arrested under this provision?
I think the attorney might be a better better person to ask for this, but typically on low-level ones, it's up to 30 days.
So you could be detained for up to 30 days under this ordinance as just part of arrest and removal.
I'm sorry, that's not true for this offense. This is a simple misdemeanor that does not allow for imprisonment. So a standard simple misdemeanor can result in a 30-day penalty, but not in this case because it's excluded. And it's excluded for almost all of our municipal simple misdemeanors. So if it's a municipal simple misdemeanor, it is not subject to imprisonment, and arrest is not the same thing. So it's a question of processing, and I can't answer that because that's going to depend on the situation.
I checked and had a conversation yesterday. I don't know how to get the data myself, but I was told that yesterday there's almost 1,000 people in the Polk County Jail, 0 for a simple misdemeanor. It's just not the way we do business as a county, but we wanted to clarify that in the ordinance so that we called out that that's not the intention.
I guess I'm confused by this process, right? Because we say imprisonment is specifically excluded, but we also say that a remedy is immediate removal. And what I've been told is there's no other way to immediately remove someone who doesn't voluntarily comply other than arrest. So I guess they would be booked, taken to jail, booked, and then released on their own accord? Is that how it would work?
That's how I understand it to work.
Okay. So it wouldn't be long-term imprisonment like the acting at this city attorney is saying, but it would be a period of time. There would be an arrest, and they would be transported somewhere.
I think, yeah. I think the reality of the situation, Josh, is that penalties are intended to be a deterrent, and the deterrent is so that our residents and the people in our community follow the directions of the police. And when the police are asking them to move on, we expect people to obey the police, and there has to be some penalty. We've made it the lowest possible penalty with a way to ensure that people that can't pay the fine won't pay the fine, and we've made sure that we've called out that they wouldn't be incarcerated, but arrested and go through the booking process so that we know over time who is really the bad actors that are shunning the rules of the community. I think all of us realize that this is a very small percentage of the homeless population that is disrespecting our people and our property. It is a very small group that the police are going to have trouble with. And I've been told by the police chief and other police officers that we get almost 100% compliance when we ask people to move on.
That's helpful. Thank you. I have some questions about the affirmative defense provision. The language says for any criminal offense under this section or section 102.407 or -407, that's the sleeping provision, it shall be an affirmative defense if space is unavailable or impracticable in a shelter within the city of Des Moines, or the person cannot afford a fine or agrees to perform community service. So my question is, well, I've got some questions about the definitions in there, but I guess I wanted to start. on how that is enforced. So are we expecting our officers who are enforcing this to know how many folks are in the shelters? Or if someone says, it's impractical for me to go to the shelter, or I can't pay a fine, does that mean they just get to stay there because they have an affirmative defense? Or do we expect a citation and then they have to lawyer up after the fact?
The latter. It would be after the fact as far as when and Tom city attorney can chime in if I'm misstating this, but the affirmative defense would not be an on-site determination. It would be after a citation was issued.
Okay. I have some questions about what impracticable means. We went through a process where we did an unsheltered study, and that identified barriers to shelter, some of which I think we're addressing with the other actions that we'll talk about on item 7 in the special meeting.
Mm-hmm.
But some of them are things like people may have PTSD and not do well in congregate settings and large group settings. So does someone who doesn't do well in a large group setting, does that qualify as impracticable? Is someone who is, one of the issues identified in the study is that there are people who experience domestic violence, and sometimes the person who is their abuser is also in the shelter. Is that part of what impracticable means? Like, I'm trying to understand.
Councilmember Mandelbaum, very likely could be. And that's including not only those scenarios, but people who might have, for whatever reason, by shelter rules, be prohibited from entering. That could include individuals who have some of the challenges that you described. Yes.
And just the practicality of implementing that defense, because impracticable, I mean, is that going to allow for an extended period of time from an impracticability perspective, or does this person who is living on the streets and may be arrested or asked to, or cited, given the $50 citation, if they want to avoid the community service or the fine with this affirmative defense, do they then need to go to the shelter and be able to document that for that specific day? Like, how is that going to work? Because they're going to have to demonstrate this after the fact, right?
Yeah, they would, under the ordinance, I think the individual would have to demonstrate why it's impracticable for them to use the emergency shelter.
So it might be impracticable, but if they don't have documentation of that, this defense isn't available to them.
The defense is available. It's up to them to establish it.
Right.
Yes.
If they're unable to document it, they don't have access to the defense.
I don't know if I can speak to what the court would accept as acceptable documentation, but if they can make the case to the court, then that would be the...
And we're not planning on providing attorneys for folks who get cited under this, are we?
Not under the municipal code, but I'm not sure if that means they won't have that available to them elsewhere.
Okay. And then the community service provision. I know we've added that, but that is also unclear. So how many hours of community service are we talking about, or is that discretionary?
I don't think that's been established, so I think it's broadly written at this point.
Are we talking 5 hours, 10 hours?
Councilman Mandelbaum, I think that's some of the discussion we're having on what we're going to instruct the city manager to do on the exceptions and what we expect him to do before we have this ordinance in place. Questions like that will be answered, and plans will be put in place and mechanisms to help people. So I think some of that discussion will be maybe that when we go through those items, and there's a couple more that we're going to add to.
Okay. I think that's
Okay.
probably
Is there
Well, I guess the one other question in terms of, do we have a sense of how much, how we're going to implement enforcement, or are we going to discuss that in?
I think
item
that
7?
is going to be, as far as enforcement, I think we say clearly what we're saying about it. So I think on the fines and everything, and we'll have more discussion in the other part. I mean, if that's what you're asking about,
But
how we're going to enforce it.
well, I guess my question, because point in time count indicates that there are 150 people outside in our community, right? And anyone who sleeps outside is violating this ordinance, right? We know that anyone who sleeps outside on any given night
In a
is
public
viola-
space.
right? And so my question is, because I've heard discussion that we're no longer complaint-based, that we are going to be going out. So are we going to be sending folks out to find the 150 folks who might be outside on any given night to issue citations? Is that how we're planning on enforcing?
That's not my intention.
No.
Okay, so we're passing this, but we don't intend to strictly enforce?
We can go to the extremes to make points. So let me match the extreme. We don't tell our police officers every day to go out and make sure that you've arrested or issued a citation to everybody that's driving a few miles an hour over the speed limit. We have rules in place. We deal with it. We sometimes give warnings. We sometimes give citations. And when people are not following the rules or cooperating, they'll have a higher level of sanction. And I view it a little bit like that we're going to be addressing these. It's a tool in the toolbox. We will be fair, reasonable, compassionate. In the end, there's been a lot of talk about increased work and how we're going to do this. The cornerstone issue of going from 10 days to 3 days is a different timeline. We're going to do the same thing. Item 7 on our agenda says that before we start doing that, we're going to do a whole bunch of stuff that reduces the barriers to going to the shelter, because the end goal, I think, of the council will be, we want people to improve their lives by getting off the streets and into shelters where there are services that this community has so generously created. We want people's lives better. And so we want a tool in the toolbox that gives us a little bit more strength in pushing and encouraging people to go to the shelter. We're not going to, if we wanted to go out and have full compliance with this today,
But so
it would be impractical, Josh. Like, you know that, and I think that's the point you're trying to make. But the reality is, that's true of every rule we have at the city. It is a tool in our toolbox to drive civility, respect for our rule of order and our common civility with each other. And we go out and enforce it when it's necessary to enforce at different levels. Clearly, and you've talked about this a lot, the first level here is asking people to move on and having a local agency that's our partner to invite them to the shelter, to see what barriers there are, and to see if the city can't help fund, provide those barriers. We're talking about a time frame. We're doing what we did at 10 days, now at 3 days. It's not a whole new process. And I think it's ironic that a lot of people might be arguing that we do it at 10 days. I don't see the rationale being really strong for the difference between 3 days and 10 days. And what they're arguing to do at 10 days is exactly the same as what we're proposing to do at 3.
yeah,
We'll talk about that. I 100% agree. And
Okay.
I voted for
Okay,
8
guys,
minutes
let's-
just now.
Okay, at this point,
So one of my questions, I guess my follow-up question, and part of what I'm trying to understand, because I think the ordinance in front of us is very broad and potentially very punitive, and that's what we will be putting on the books. And what I am hearing is that maybe what we're trying to solve is a certain piece of the visibility, and you're trying to move folks, some folks. That's the way it sounds.
I never use the word visibility, and I don't want to infer that, and I don't want you to believe that that's my opinion. My opinion is our people need some services. They need restrooms downtown. But you want to know something? Our restrooms are broken because of overnight vandalism and we need to do better on that. The people that are ruining our property and disregarding our people have to be the ones that we deal with. And right now, we don't have a tool to deal with that.
Okay, at this point, I am just going to close this work session because I think we need to get on. I think you've had your opportunity to have your questions. We've had comments. I believe we need to move on to our meeting where some of the questions you have could possibly be offered and answered for not only you, but the people in our audience. So,
Can we take a few minutes?
yes, at this time, I'm going to close the work session. We will reconvene